Okay, guys, so I made the mistake of reblogging a couple of memes earlier today. You know, if I get 12 sings in my inbox, I'll sing you a song, and if I get 12 reads in my inbox, I'll read you a book. As it turns out, I can't sing without the radio being on or the sound of the lyrics in the background being sung by the actual professional singer and just kind of harmonizing my terrible voice in there with it. So, I'm not going to be singing for you today because it's going to be awful. So, what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to read you three stories. The first one is actually a very short passage from World War Z, which is one of my very favorite books. You knew these were going to be scary, so sit down, get comfortable, find a blanket to snuggle with because Mama Don's going to tell you some scary stories. Okay, this chapter is called The Great Panic. Parnell Air National Guard Base, Memphis, Tennessee, USA. Gavin Blair pilots one of the D-17 combat dirigibles that make up the core of America's Civil Air Patrol. It is a task well suited for him. In civilian life, he piloted a Fujifilm blimp. It stretched the horizon. Sedans, trucks, buses, RVs, anything that could drive. I saw tractors. I saw a cement mixer. Seriously, I even saw a flatbed with nothing but a giant sign on it, a billboard advertising a gentleman's club. People were sitting on top of it. People were riding on top of everything, on roofs, in between luggage racks. It reminded me of some old picture of trains in India with people hanging on them like monkeys. All kinds of crap lined the road. Suitcases, boxes, even pieces of expensive furniture. I saw a grand piano. I'm not kidding, just smashed like it was thrown off the top of a truck. There were also a lot of abandoned cars. Some had been pushed over, some were stripped, some looked burned out. I saw a lot of people on foot, walking across the plains or alongside the road. Some were knocking on windows, holding up all kinds of stuff. A few women were exposing themselves. They must have been looking to trade, probably for gas. They couldn't have been looking for rides. They were moving faster than the cars. Wouldn't make sense, but back down the road about 30 miles, traffic was moving a little better. You'd think the mood would be calmer. It wasn't. People were flashing their lights, bumping the cars in front of them, getting out and throwing down. I saw a few people lying by the side of the road, barely moving or not at all. People were running past them, carrying stuff, carrying children, or just running, all in the same direction of the traffic. A few miles later, I saw why. Those creatures were swarming among the cars. Drivers on the outer lanes tried to veer off the road, sticking in the mud, trapping the inner lanes. People couldn't open their doors. The cars were too tightly packed. I saw those things reach in open windows, pulling people out or pulling themselves in. A lot of drivers were trapped inside. Their doors were shut and, I'm assuming, locked. Their windows rolled up. It was safety-tempered glass. The dead couldn't get in, but the living couldn't get out. I saw a few people panic, try to shoot through their windshields, destroying the only protection they had. Stupid. They might have bought themselves a few hours in there, maybe even a chance to escape. Maybe there was no escape, just a quicker end. There was a horse trailer hitched to a pickup in the center lane. It was rocking crazily back and forth. The horses were still inside. The swarm continued among the cars, literally eating its way up the stalled lanes, all those poor bastards just trying to get away. And that's what haunts me the most about it. They weren't headed anywhere. This was the I-80, a strip of highway between Lincoln and North Platte. Both places were heavily infested, as well as all those little towns in between. What did they think they were doing? Who organized this exodus? Did anyone? Did people see a line of cars and join them without asking? I tried to imagine what it must have been like, stuck bumper to bumper, crying kids, barking dog, knowing what was coming a few miles back and hoping, praying someone up ahead knows where he's going. You ever hear about that experiment an American journalist did in Moscow in the 1970s? He just lined up at some building, nothing special about it, just a random door. Sure enough, someone got in line behind him. Then a couple more, and before you know it, they were backed up around the block. No one asked what the line was for. They just assumed it was worth it. I can't say if that story was true. Maybe it's just an urban legend or a Cold War myth. Who knows? So that is the passage from World War Z, and I'm going to grab my energy drink because I'm dying over here. I've had a sore throat for the past couple of days, so hopefully this does not end up being too croaky and ridiculous. Next, we're going to do a short story from Edgar Allan Poe. You can tell that this book is much loved. It's got doodles in the margins. The front cover tore off in my backpack some years back, and I just can't bring myself to get another one. I love this book. Until it falls apart, I will keep it. So this story is actually called The Oval Portrait. It's a pretty good one. I like it. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less in fact than in fancy, of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces but in very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary, in these paintings my incipient delirium perhaps had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. Long, long I read, and devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche in the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in a vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly, then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent even to my own perception, but while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reasoning for shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw aright I could not and would not doubt, for the first flashing of candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses and startle me at once into waking life. The portrait, I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favourite heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded and filigreed in Moresque. As a thing of art nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself. but it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance which had so suddenly and vehemently moved me. Least of all, it could be said that my fancy, shaken from its half slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained, for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture, in an absolute lifelikeliness of expression, which at first startling, finally confounding, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe I replaced the candelabrum to its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from my view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art. She, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as a young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber, where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day, and he was a passionate and a wild and moody man, who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see the light which fell so ghastly in the lone turret, withered the health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on, and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labour drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardour of his work, and turned his eyes from his canvas rarely even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth, and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp, and then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought, but in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, crying with a loud voice, "This is life itself!" turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. And that is the end of the oval portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. God, I love Poe. I'm sure you can tell. All right, the last one is actually going to be kind of a sillier story. It is technically a true tale. Well, in as much as folklore can be true. This is from a book called Passing Strange. It is True Tales of New England Hauntings and Horrors, and it was gathered by an archivist. I do forget which is he. He is... Let me see. I believe he's actually an archivist, technically speaking. He's a folklorist, archivist, something, whatever. The point here is that this guy, his name is Joseph A. Citro, has gone around New England gathering all these many and various stories from different areas, different sections, digging things up in newspapers and what have you, and has selected some of the finest stories that New England has to offer with the most proof, hearsay, evidence from back in the day that he could possibly gather, and has put them all together in this wonderful book. I'm going to read you one called Water, Water Everywhere. For a long time, I thought Dr. Waterman's situation was unique. Then I discovered that after concluding its wet work with the Waterman family, Windsor's water sprite apparently picked up and moved south. About a decade later, it, or one of its pesky kinsfolk, reappeared, taking up residence with the Francis Martin family of Methuen, Massachusetts. Commencing on Tuesday, October 25th, 1963, Mr. and Mrs. Martin and their 11-year-old daughter confronted their uninvited guest in the TV room. They were watching some evening programs when someone noticed a peculiar wet spot on the wall. Before anyone could react, they heard a loud popping sound like a firecracker. Or perhaps champagne cork would be a better analogy, because right after the pop, a stream of water squirted from the wet patch on the wall, arcing directly into the room, splattering on the floor. It was as if a water pipe had burst, but oddly, there were no pipes behind that particular wall. This fantastic fountain ran for a good 2 hours, while similar water spouts began erupting here and there all over the house. It was as if someone was turning on invisible faucets hooked up to non-existent water lines. Each spout would last about 20 seconds, then recur at approximately 15-minute intervals. More curiously, after a water spout erupted, no hole in the wall or wall covering was detectable. When mops and dehumidifying equipment proved useless, the mystified Martins called for help. Neighbors and local officials trooped through. A crew of city firemen, the leaders of which possessed extensive architectural knowledge, examined the building for leaks. They determined the roof was flawless. After several hours of investigation, no one was able to find so much as a single suspicious imperfection. Since no one could find the water's source, no one could shut it off. By Friday, persistent wetness, unexpected geysers, and a general feeling of distorted reality had thoroughly dampened their spirits. Events forced the Martin family to leave, abandoning their home to the spurts and the experts. Luckily, they had relatives close by who offered to take them in. Nonetheless, every day they trudged dutifully back to clean up and continue their search for the water's source. Surrounded by the usual cavalcade of skeptics, plumbers, building inspectors, and police, everyone scratched their hair thin trying to come up with a slightly cogent explanation. One witness testified that he saw water cascading down the staircase like a waterfall. Another measured a 1-inch accumulation on the floor. Sometimes a quart or so would splash out of nowhere all at once. By November 1st, water was bubbling and shooting from the walls and furniture in 5 rooms at the same time. A national roofing company from Boston dispatched an engineer to test the home. Right away, he noted the accumulation of more than a quart of water on the sofa. Naturally, suspecting a leak, he tore down a section of plasterboard nearby, only to find it and the insulation behind it dry as a bone. He and 6 other examiners concluded formally that there was nothing whatsoever wrong with the building, structurally. Still, the baffled family members and confused consultants tried everything they could think of. They shut off the water supply to the house and drained the pipes. They made sure that the heat was turned off, and they opened all the windows to encourage ventilation. They even raised the shades to admit the maximum amount of sunlight. All to no avail. Pops sounded, water spouted, nothing helped. Now living with Mrs. Martin's parents, the family hoped for succor. Their sanctuary was the middle floor of a 3-story apartment house in nearby Lawrence. Bizarre as it seems, when the Martins moved in, the water sprite tagged along with them. The whole popping and splashing scenario began all over again at the new location. Again, experts examined the roof and the plumbing. They investigated every nook, cranny, and crawl space. Water kept pouring in. Even as they watched, no one could could determine its source. It may be important to note that the walls squirted only in the apartment where the Martins were staying. No unusual moisture bedeviled the families above or below. Needless to say, suspicion fell on the daughter. The experts could find no natural law to explain this problem, so instead, local police were willing to believe that dozens of people had been completely bamboozled by an 11-year-old girl. Was she a scapegoat? Well, here's what happened. 12 adults were milling around in the in-laws' 5-room Lawrence apartment. Water was splashing everywhere. Amid this commotion, one of the cops caught the girl at the kitchen sink having a glass of water, and that was evidence enough. The police called the problem solved and went back to the station house to report everything had been the work of the mischievous youngster. On the other hand, the deputy fire chief was a bit more analytical. He had seen the girl helping to mop up the floor while water was exploding in 4 or 5 places at once. Word leaked out, of course, and local newspapers had their Halloween story for 1963. Soon parades of gawkers found their ways to the Methuen home, making life miserable for all concerned. The more aggressive curiosity seekers actually wanted to touch afflicted family members, thinking they would somehow benefit spiritually from the contact. Ultimately, perhaps following the example of Windsor's Waterman family, the Martins did the only thing they could do. They announced that the problem had been solved. They reported that a hole had finally been discovered in the roof of their Methuen home, which they said accounted for the whole thing. Of course, that failed to explain the equally weird goings-on with the in-laws' place in Lawrence, or where the water came from on sunny days. Also similar to the Windsor episode, the Methuen and Lawrence phenomena were short-lived. Though differences do exist, all 3 cases are identical in at least one way. They were never solved. The phenomena just stopped, ended, ran their course, and dried up. Unlike the Windsor story, investigators did identify what may have been a couple of clues. First, just before the pop and splash, there would be a sudden and unexplainable rise in the humidity in the room. Then, after the jet of water had ceased, the sore spot on the wall would feel warm, sometimes hot to the touch. These are the sorts of maddening clues that seem to deepen rather than explain the mystery. Why should either condition result in jets of water arching from unpunctured wallpaper and plasterboard? Natural or supernatural? Your guess is as good as mine. If water was obeying natural laws, as skeptics insist it must, why didn't gravity make it trickle to the floor and form a pool? How could it possibly spew horizontally, as if under pressure, from unperforated plasterboard? And how could it flow at several locations all over the house, even when it wasn't raining outside? In any event, the public was satisfied with the Martins' explanation, and soon the whole strange business was forgotten. When all is said and done, the only thing I can state with confidence is that so far no one has offered a single explanation that holds water. And somewhere, way off in the distance, I seem to hear a faint, sardonic burst of laughter. Well, that is the end of the 3 stories. I am sorry that I am not singing for you, but trust me, I am doing you all a solid by not singing for you. Thank you for your patience. This has been actually a much shorter video than my usual weekly videos. As usual, enjoy, watch at your own risk. Inbox is always open. Feel free to stop by. And thanks for giving me this task, guys. Have a great night.